being found in the lower level, 2 or 3 feet deep in the intertidal zone and having lingering effects. That was one. And the other has to do with herring. And herring was something that everyone assumed would recover so quickly, and yet we're 20 years later and there's still a great bit of debate about why herring from that stress. And they got blown away, and people assumed they'd recover because herring's so prolific in Prince William Sound, but they still, those two were were big dramatic surprises to us, and were terrible and are still not really understood today.
We circle back to the NERDA and the task force and the funding. You know, one of the things that I think it needs to be understood is that there is a responsibility under our laws for BP to pay for the damage that occurred up to sort of put the Gulf back the way it was. But there also will be penalties associated with Clean Water Act, and those penalties currently go into the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, I believe is the right term. And actually, those funds are currently not available for Gulf cleanup, but are, without congressional change, would be kept in account for future spills. I know there's some, one of the recommendations of the Mavis report was to revisit that. And Jim, you want to talk about that? I know you spent a lot on how can we find the resources and trying to do some of the work we've been talking about here today.
Yeah, okay, so let me talk about the Clean Water Act civil penalties. I'm wondering, just as an introduction to this for 1 minute, if I could show floor slides 30, 31, 32, and 33 very quickly. Can they be brought up? 30, we've talked about the watershed, if it comes up, slide number 30, the watershed of the Mississippi, but it's huge. It goes all the way from western New York into Montana and so on, Colorado. Huge part of the country. This is all focused and connected to the Gulf through the Mississippi River and the delta of the Mississippi River. The next one is just another version of the land loss that we've already seen, loss of 2,300 square miles of coastal wetlands. This delta is the heart of the Gulf. I mean, it's the beating heart. So we're losing a lot. And the next one shows just one view of the oil and gas infrastructure. So when we talk about the oil spill and the Clean Water Act penalties, one should understand by way of backdrop, the context, that the oil and gas industry, both onshore and now increasingly offshore, OCS, has had an incredible impact on this deltaic ecosystem, just because of the thousands of miles of pipeline canals, navigation canals, equipment canals, refineries, storage tanks, and so on. A huge impact. So I say that's by way of background because I think it tends to provide, from a national point of view, justification for using oil and gas funds that are available. And now the question is BP oil spill dollars for restoration. And just the last one I'll show you, which is, this is a picture from late April of 2008 during a high water period. You can see the plume. This is the finer grains of the Mississippi River. They all need to be redirected so they build wetlands rather than create the dead zone out in the Gulf. Now, the Clean Water Act allows for penalties ranging from up to about $1,100 per barrel of spilled oil under a strict liability theory, up to something in the order of, I think it's $4,300 per barrel if there's a finding of gross negligence. And you can all sort of add up those figures. But one can imagine that the penalty during a settlement would be many billions of dollars, a lot of money. And the question that has been posed by the Mavis report, now by the Oil Spill Commission, and certainly I can assure you the national environmental community is posing it, and that is, isn't it under all of these circumstances, given the role of the federal government in what is in the collapse of this ecosystem, the long-term role of the oil and gas industry, the specific damage done by the oil spill, the need to re-engineer the Mississippi River because the navigation system is collapsing just as the wetlands are, the flood control system, the fisheries of the Gulf. All this oil and gas infrastructure is going to be much more susceptible to storm surge as this loss continues. Isn't it reasonable to take a very significant portion of those penalties and direct them to Gulf restoration, with a significant portion of those dollars going to the restoration of this delta ecosystem? And it seems to me the answer to that is yes. To some degree, this can be done administratively through what EPA calls a supplemental environmental project. But there are certain kinds of limitations as to how far that can go administratively. And I think as a practical matter, if the country is going to divert many billions of dollars in oil spill, Clean Water Act civil penalties to restoration of the Mississippi Delta and other parts of the Gulf coastal ecosystem, there's going to have to be some expression of support from the Congress of the United States. And that means making the case that this is a nationally important economic and environmental asset, and this is an absolutely essential long-term investment for this country. But the money should be there. A year or two ago, nobody anticipated that this money would be forthcoming. And certainly some of it needs to go to the Treasury. But I think and I hope all of us can make an argument that a very significant portion of it should be directed in a way that can produce some good out of this awful oil spill.
Steve, I've got some great questions from the audience. I've got so many of them, I think we need a whole other session, but there's two that sort of fall in your bailiwick. How, if at all, has the restoration process been hindered by the lack of good baseline scientific information in the Gulf? And the second related question is sort of how do we monitor for what's going on in the deep part of the Gulf? Can give us some perspective on the science in that area and the needs that you see.
Well, thanks. And that's a great question, and I think it follows up from Jim Ayer's question.
Can you pass that question up?
Yeah, I wrote it on a 3x5 card. And that is, what's the role of science here? And in many cases, we're talking about what do we want to restore? And science will help us through the NERDA process and other things to figure out the natural resources that are damaged. We haven't really talked a lot about the damages to civil society here, and I think one of the big resulting damages was the brand for Gulf seafood, and clearly that's a long-term restoration issue. We can restore all the populations, but if the consumers aren't going to eat them, then we've got a serious economic problem. But I also think that monitoring and science can help us figure out what we want to restore the Gulf to. What are the baselines that we want to restore to? In some cases, we tend to use temporal baselines, saying that we want to maybe perhaps go back to the Gulf in 1970 or 1950, et cetera. Unfortunately, there are very few data that one would measure against, and so this argues that not only do we put together a monitoring program for the specific restoration activities, but it become a little bit more holistic. Clearly, we've talked about the restoration of damages through NERDA, but it quickly bootstrapped into a much larger discussion about what the restoration of the Gulf would look like if we abated nutrients and stopped the loss of wetlands. And so, what do we want to rebuild that Gulf to, or what would the target be? And science really, I think, in a decision theoretic way, can actually help us a lot here. And part of this is articulating the benefits and costs to society to actually do that restoration. Because clearly, we could stop all commercial activity there and we would have a perfectly functional ecosystem probably restore itself. But it's the benefits to society that we want. So I think there's the questions of ecological monitoring and then also the socioeconomic monitoring that are very critical, not only to seeing if our restoration efforts are working, they're effective, but also establishing the endpoints.
Yeah, I think it's very important, particularly being charged to look at the Gulf of Mexico as an ecosystem. I was struck when I was working in the region that there didn't seem to be good data for the really valuable aspects of the Gulf. The monitoring data and any kind of a way you could really make good regulatory decisions or scientific judgments about what was going on there were really lacking. So I think that's got to be a part of what we look forward to in this restoration effort.
Yeah, I think if you look at the monitoring data, they're very patchy. I mean, there are time series in some aspects of it, but not in others. And clearly, if we're looking at multiple simultaneous restoration activities, we need to focus on the interactions between those aspects, which really cries out for an ecosystem approach.
Yes.
Cindy, you want to talk a little bit? I mean, we've got NERDA, we've got our new task force in the Gulf. We obviously have a lot of folks that are very interested in the Gulf of Mexico, which is, to me, the most important thing, is that folks need to keep explaining to their neighbors why it's important to care about the Gulf and how important it is. But there are some challenges to trying to accomplish our mission, I thought you're in one of the best positions of anybody in this process to kind of look forward and say, here's what we need to be paying attention to.
So I want to add a little bit on to what Steve was saying too. And I'll get to the question he just gave me. The monitoring and the question of the long-term monitoring and the baseline information. Part of not only the NERDA, but the overall restoration is going to have to be the baseline information where we're at and whether or not we collected the information we needed pre-spill. So do we have the information we need? But we also have to think about the long-term monitoring. We know for a fact, if you think about the sea turtles that were released, those juvenile sea turtles, those hatchlings, they're not going to come back for years to come. We don't know what the impacts will be. So we have to think about the long term. What are the impacts to the seagrasses and so many species that rely on the seagrasses as we go for this? So there's information for long-term monitoring and the research that Jim had talked about that we're going to have to go forward with. And then when you think about restoration, you heard earlier panelists talk about the fact that there's still oil out there. So there's still hundreds of miles that are being oiled. So we go forward with restoration, but we're going to have to be careful where we restore at this point, so we're not going to go to an area that is still impaired, still degraded. And we want to make sure as we go forward that these efforts that complement each other for overall restoration are going to be sustainable as we go forward. So those are some of the things. You have a point?
No, Cindy and I were talking about this earlier, and I just want to add something that maybe generate a little stir.
All right, now we're going to get frisky.
Yeah. And Pete Peterson and some other scientists on the panel before were talking about this. And I want to be clear that I think BP is, they've stepped up much differently than at least my dealings with Exxon. And I certainly do not have a favorite in the oil industry, and they don't see me as a favorite. But I do want to say that BP's $50 million a year, the $500 million, is terrific. Just like the $20 billion for whatever that's, the restoration and damages and so forth. But that is not what we're talking about when we talk about a science panel with a peer review capability, building a science backdrop. That may be a piece, it would fit in well. But I want to make sure I'm clear that that's not the answer. The answer is to have an established Gulf monitoring, ecosystem monitoring and research program. And it sets standards, and it has projects related to the things that Cindy's working on about restoration of species and habitat and so forth. And that panel very well may, and it will seek peer review of proposals so that someone doesn't get to come out of their hip pocket with one. And the GRI may be a piece of that. But BP's program is not the program I'm talking about. That's just a program. So I want to make sure I was clear on that one. And I don't think that's the answer for this country in the long run with regard to a commitment to restoration for these large marine ecosystems.
Cindy, if I come back to you just for a minute, we've got a lot of folks that need to coordinate to make all of this work. Do you have any thoughts about how we can make that work better in terms of coordinating all these ships of state that we have that have critical